So today we're exploring, as the title says, what is resilience and its relevance to peace building today, peace building in today's complex and conflict-prone world. Oh my God, I'm seeing all kinds of friends. Hi. Great to see you. In Eastern Europe, the Horn, the Sahel, everywhere in the world, we're witnessing a rise in conflict, a rise in instability, and also in terms of resource scarcity. And in this context, resilience is an interesting topic to look at. A lot of actors use resilience, whether it's policymakers, practitioners, and even scholars. To really try and understand how communities or systems can withstand shocks, can recover from shocks, but also, and this is at the interpeace lens, also transform following a conflict. It's not just about bouncing back from conflicts or from protracted conflicts. You don't just bounce back or absorb. The idea is really to transform. But is resilience just another buzzword? We often say, is resilience old wine in a new bottle that looks really nice and shiny? And what does it really mean, essentially? Can we measure resilience? Can we actually transform the theory into practice? Is it possible to operationalize resilience? And can it really contribute meaningfully to conflict prevention? So that's the point of our discussion today. It's meant to be extremely interactive. We're going to first hear from our esteemed panelists in terms of just a little bit from the contextual lens, also from the methodological lens, and also the operational lens as well. And with these insights in our discussion today, we hope to be able to develop a white paper that can be used in terms to bring coherence to how resilience can be integrated into conflict prevention strategies. So I am welcoming my esteemed dear friends and colleagues, some I haven't seen in person in 8 years, so it's really thrilling to be having this panel here today. I have Ilke, Alex, Abiose, and we have one panelist online, which is now online. This is great. Abdon, welcome as well. You're online with us. It's great to see you as well. So with that, my job, at least for the introduction, is done. I'm actually going to hand it over to Ilke, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what does resilience mean. So over to you, Ilke.
Thank you very much, Renee. I hope we're not victims of the technology, because I don't know whether I can change the slides here. The pointer's not working, but I'll start with introducing myself. I'm Ilke. I am SeeD Director General, Center for Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development. We've been partners with Interpeace since our birth. And today we're going to try to answer this big question of what is resilience from 4 angles: conceptual, methodological, analytical. Then we're going to look at the empirical and operational policy angle, where we will do small group work and all the creative stuff. We also have little notes and cards on the tables. If you could use the QR code to go into the Mentimeter, we're creating a live cloud on what resilience is and why it's important to you. Just to also compare that what is it called? The cloud Mentimeter output to what we've done online on social media. My section today is going to focus on the concepts, so a little bit less juicy than the analytics, empirics, and the policy and operational aspect of resilience, but hopefully it will set the foundations of what is resilience, how we conceptualize it, why it's a very attractive, popular concept, and give us that anchor for the analytical, methodological, and empirical aspects. So we've asked the public on social media, got 100 responses, what is resilience, and several different connotations, adjectives, and symbols popped up. And of course, historically and culturally, there has been a lot of symbols of resilience, right? From dandelions to phoenix to helixes, but all of these symbols have similar representations in terms of endurance, longevity, flexibility, adaptability, strength. Sorry, the slides are not working. But overall, like what Renee said, it's not just bouncing back. And I think that's what we all know and commonly understand resilience as. It's not bouncing back. What I've also said very poetically before, it's also bouncing forward. So adaptability, learning, flexibility is key part of understanding resilience as a concept. I think I will need for the slides to work at one point. I can only stretch my introduction so far. I'll turn to my laptop as a backup. I think what I wanted to also talk about before we discuss what resilience is, what resilience isn't, and try to make the concept a little bit tighter, because resilience has become so attractive and popular and a sexy concept for us as peace builders and development architects, especially since the sustaining peace agenda, that it can become unintelligible, right? If it becomes really big and fluid, it becomes very hard to operate with, it becomes very hard to measure and pin down, and it becomes a buzzword that is unintelligible. So what is resilience? What is it not? It's not but just bouncing back. It's also transforming and learning. It's not just absence of risk and fragility, right? It's more than absence of risk and fragility. It's not just social cohesion. While social cohesion could enable resilience, or having social cohesion can help us cope with stressors and shocks, social cohesion in itself is not necessarily resilience. And we see this a lot in contexts where, for instance, small rural communities that are homogeneous, social cohesion might be easier to establish, but that doesn't mean when faced with a stressor or a shock that social cohesion will hold. It's not any positive skill or any asset or any capacity that is positive. So positive skills, positive coping mechanisms sometimes do not work in our benefit depending on what the stressor is. And that's one thing that we've learned from the context, that is resilience factor, resilience capacity in one context may not be that helpful, or resilience capacity in another, or when faced with a different challenge. I'll give you an example from Liberia. Empathy. We see empathy as a resilience capacity when it comes to intergroup harmony, intergroup tension. But empathy can be a fragility factor when you're faced with economic insecurity and food insecurity. And we've seen this empirically in Liberia, where empaths, people with strong empathic scores, that empathy hindered their future orientation and their saving mentality, because they're very empathetic. They give out and they fall into vicious cycles of poverty and food insecurity. So that basically illustrates that not any positive skill is resilience, but also resilience is not just positive, right? In our understanding, it's transformative, it's learning. So we take a positive lens to resilience. But also conceptually and theoretically, resilience can be maladaptive, right? We sometimes deal with stress and shocks and challenges, turning to drugs and alcohol. So sometimes resilience is maladaptive, and we can develop bad coping strategies or unsustainable coping strategies. And we see that a lot when we're faced with climate change and how unsustainable coping strategies emerge in the face of environmental shocks and stressors. Resilience is not every SDG target either. Neither is it universal solution. Just as the Liberia example, it's not a standard package that we can take and apply and build all these skills and capacities and transform them and replicate them from one context to another. And sometimes resilience packages are so tailored and so contextual, not even on the national, but subnational, community, group, and even individual level. Next slide, please. I want to also talk a little bit about what we learned implementing resilience studies and resilience analysis in 20-odd countries. So there are common denominators, right? While resilience is very textured, very tailored, very contextual, at the same time, there are common resilience factors that keep emerging from different contexts. One of them is inclusive and participatory decision-making. We've seen this as a resilience factor in several concepts from Ukraine to Ethiopia. And it's a resilience factor that helps people protect themselves and groups and communities against the impact of war and conflict. Inclusive identity and mindset. This is also a resilience factor, resilience capacity that keeps emerging, and we've detected it in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Ethiopia as well, particularly protective against polarizing narratives and exclusive narratives. And you can see in this list that these resilience factors are protecting against 4 different outcomes, right? So negotiation skills, we've seen this among adolescents, in particular in Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and also in Ukraine. It was a protective factor for young people to maintain a constructive, progressive civic attitudes. Growth mindset and agency has emerged as a resilience factor for to protect against vulnerability to armed groups in places like Niger, Ivory Coast, and Burkina Faso. Gender equity and inclusion, a resilience factor for intergroup harmony. So in this case, it's not against something, but it's for something. And in Ethiopia, Niger, and Liberia, we detected this in a similar way. And of course, there are specific material assets that are resilience factors, right? If you own a fridge or a mobile phone, or if you grow peas rather than bananas, or chickens rather than cows, these might be protective factors, again, depending on the context and the type of fragility or type of stressor that the communities are facing. There are, next slide, please. There are different definitions of resilience across disciplines. And these definitions converge in terms of how they look at resilience and how adaptive, flexible learning it is, and that is a coping strategy. But they also study resilience at a different system. So that's where they diverge. While peace building studies resilience on societal and institutional level, psychology studies resilience on individual and family level, sociology studies it on societal and group level, political science studies it on an institutional level. So different disciplines and different literatures have slightly different definitions of resilience, but they again converge in terms of how systemic it is and how adaptable and flexible it is in terms of how it should be applied as a lens. So our definition of resilience is that it's any endogenous attribute, capacity, resource, or a response that enables individuals, communities, and institutions to peacefully deal with the impact of conflict and violence or stressors and shocks, as well as to adapt and learn to prevent them from emerging and persisting. So that learning is a key part of our definition. And why is resilience lens important? First of all, it's an empowering lens, right? It empowers individuals, empowers communities, it empowers institutions, peace and development actors, because it focuses on learning and self-organized response. It focuses on involvement of the local actors, and it focuses on indigenous and indigenous capacities, things that we already have that we can leverage and we can enhance or we can replicate. It's context and conflict sensitive almost by default, because it goes above and beyond the fragility lenses, and it goes above and beyond looking at vulnerability, and it looks basically not top down into huge institutional reform, but bottom up in terms of what are the capacities that can be leveraged. It's flexible and versatile, and one of the strengths of resilience and why it's so attractive is because it has systems thinking at its core. And it's a socio-ecological approach, right? It looks at systems on these different levels and dimensions by default. So it's flexible and versatile, and that's why it's so attractive to different sectors and literatures. But it's also why it can be, if we use it well and operationalize it well, why it can actually help us bring coherence to peace building, humanitarian work, and development work. So this peace building, humanitarian development work, that coherence is also a need and an emerging priority. And resilience lens can help us do that. And lastly, it's future-proof. It helps us future-proof it because there is that sustainability and forward-looking in application and adaptation of resilience lenses. However, I want to also give a word of caution, right? It's not a magic wand or a easy solution, and we need to maintain a critical stance towards resilience. We need to make sure that we're not shifting responsibility to individuals and to local communities unfairly, especially when they're dealing with things that it's not completely within their control or within their sphere of influence. And especially when we're at risk of underestimating the need of support, whether external support or institutional support, but that need to share responsibility. It can, if not applied appropriately and with a more holistic systemic lens, overemphasize self-sufficiency, and that basically can disable and dull our crisis management approaches because it doesn't look at systemic inequalities, and it looks and it over-focuses on adapting to the status quo, coping with the status quo, right? So we don't want to overemphasize self-sufficiency and kind of dull our crisis management and critical lenses to how we can challenge more systemic interventions. And so resilience should be also seen as a process rather than an outcome, and an end goal, rather than an end goal, allowing us to be iterative, to focus on sustainability, and again to advocate for collective responsibility. And I can't emphasize that enough, that we don't want to over focus on on individual and shift responsibility. Our approach to resilience as a SeeD and interpiece and the studies that we've been conducting has been multi-systemic. So we look at all these different systems from individual, family, national, community, institutional, and try to do a socio-ecological understanding and network understanding of what resilience is. And maybe at times, depending on time and resources, we need to zoom into systems, and we may not be able to ideally study all of them at once, but we have that understanding and that interaction. And it is multidimensional. Maybe we don't want to silo it into peace building alone, or economic capital alone, or assets and material assets alone. We look at it multidimensionally, and in our study and approach, we try to understand it in terms of capitals. Human capital, social capital, institutional capital, technological, natural capital, and those dimensions also help us detect and how resilience emerges and manifests itself on different levels. But across all systems and across all dimensions, we look at resilience as absorptive, something that can withstand shocks and stressors without significant disruption. We look at resilience as adaptive, that adjusts and evolves in response to challenges. And we look at it as transformative, that it fundamentally alters systems and reduces vulnerabilities. And we also look at it not only as against something, as a protective, a coping mechanism, but also for something, for sustainability, peace development as a preventative lens as well. Lastly, I will end on this slide and pass the ball to my colleague Alex to tell you a little bit more about methodology and analytics of resilience and how we can turn this concept and taxonomy into something that's measurable and applicable. And we will also come back to the Mentimeter at the end during the reflection session and see, put side by side the public creation and your creation, and see where our understandings overlap. This is a taxonomy of potential resilience capacities towards standardization of metrics and frameworks. And because one of the challenges with resilience is not its definition or conceptualization, there is convergence on that, but how do we turn that into standardized metrics and frameworks while we can remain contextually relevant and contextually tailored? So this is where you can see the several domains. They can be expanded and the levels that we look at from individual, family to regional and continental, and that helps us basically build a framework and categorization of different resilience capacities. Under each column and row, we can then pinpoint different skills, assets, response mechanisms, and then look how they manifest at different levels. Under human capital, we can look at distress tolerance, critical thinking, growth mindset, negotiation skills. So at least we've got a framework of what skills might emerge as resilience capacities. They might not, depending on the context, but we're looking and then trying to investigate and have a checklist of which are relevant and what is the state of them, whether it is worth enhancing, replicating, or investing in them. For technological capital, it can be things like access to ICT, information, modern irrigation systems. For institutional capital, efficient and inclusive service delivery, broken down to education, health, infrastructure, welfare, or inclusive justice. For natural capital, access and availability of sustainable resources or water. For economic capital, we can look at economic security, health investments, and inflation rates. But basically, this framework is what helps us to take a resilience lens and try to turn it into something that is measurable and pin it down into metrics. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And over to you, Alex. This is not working, so you could my laptop if you like.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, my name is Alex Guest. I'm head of research over at SeeD. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for coming. My eyesight is not so resilient. Can we go full screen? If not, I think I can just stand closer and I'll be okay. Full screen is an issue. Okay, that's fine. I think it was the other one was okay as well. No worries. So I think what I'm going to talk to you about today is to answer some of the questions around how do you actually measure resilience, right? It's a brilliant concept, it's an amazing conceptual framework, but how do you actually instrumentalize it as part of your peace building programs, as part of your NGO work, as part of anything that you want to do around the dimensions and concepts that Ilke mentioned. So when should we be thinking about using a resilience lens? Well, firstly, it's when you want to understand and quantify, which is quite an interesting challenge, how resilient someone or some community or some country or some system is, or how fragile it is. And I put it to you that there is a way to quantify with a number how resilient someone is. Another situation where you might want to use a resilience lens is because you want to understand why someone or some community or some institution is resilient. What are the underlying reasons that make that person or that system resilient? And finally, something that Ilke touched upon, it's also a really important lens to use if you've accepted or identified that the challenges that people are facing are difficult to eliminate, right? And you kind of have to accept that we live in a context, or that system is in a context which is constantly under threat, adversities, conflict, and so on and so forth, which is a difficult thing to accept, right? Because your gut feeling would be to change the underlying dynamics, but sometimes you just have to use resilience lens. Can we move to the next one? So the kind of questions that you can answer with a resilience lens is things like what helps households ensure they have food security in the face of environmental shocks like droughts. That's a resilience question, right? Another resilience question is what helps communities maintain their sense of security when conflict is escalating. Okay, that's another kind of resilience question. And finally, taking the individual level, another kind of resilience question might be something like what helps individuals avoid becoming radicalized when they're exposed to divisive narratives, right? And these are all really relevant questions in the world right now. And you see that I've highlighted some words in those sentences, not just because I like colorful slides, but also because to define a meaningful resilience question, you need to define the agent or the system that you're talking about. So households, communities, individuals, organizations, schools, or whatever else it might be. You have to define the affected outcome that you're interested in ensuring that that system maintains, that ensuring food on the table, ensuring a sense of security, ensuring that radicalization is avoided. Yeah, that's the affected outcome. And also you need to define what adversity you're trying to become resilient against. Is it drought or earthquakes or famine or conflict or polarization, or what is it? If you don't define those three things, you don't have a meaningful resilience question. And something that I might come back to at the end of my section is to challenge you guys to think about the work that you're doing and if a resilience question emerges from what you're trying to do. And it could be anything. It could be, how do I help NGOs ensure funding in the face of funding scarcity, right? That's a resilience question as well. So I challenge you to think of a resilience question and write it down. And I'd be really interested to hear what are the priority questions that you guys are thinking about at the end of my section. So earlier I talked about quantifying how resilient the system is, which is a big ask. And the way to do that is to start thinking about resilience as doing better than expected, given the circumstances. So the answer to the question, what is the quantity of resilience that this person has or this system has? It's precisely the answer to the question, how much better is that person doing given what I expect them to be doing, right? So if you can just click once more. So imagine that you surveyed a bunch of households and you measured the amount of exposure to an adversity like environmental shocks, like drought, for example. But you also, for each of those households, you measure their food security. And what you're probably going to find is a graph like this. For those of you who are data geeks, I'm sure you guys are having a great time right now. For the rest of you, sorry, you'll start listening again in 5 minutes. Please don't turn off though. You'll find a relationship like this, right? So households that are more exposed to adversity, that are further right along the diagram, have less food security, right? And then if you click once more, you'll see that you can probably draw a line, right? You can even see it with your eyes that the more shocks there are, the less food security there is. That's a problem. Ideally, we should be able to be working on environmental shocks, but actually climate change is a hard thing to change, right? Definitely not in the short term. But what you can start thinking about is you can start asking about specific households. For example, this one, did you click? This household is actually really resilient, right? Because although it's exposed to loads of adversity, it's doing so much better on food security than where we expect it to be. And the black diagonal line is precisely where we expect it to be. If you can click once more, you can consider this household. This household has a lot more food security, but it's not really that resilient. It's more or less about where we expect households that only have a drought once every 3 years to be, right? Conversely, this household right here, even though it's not, one more click, please. This household right here, number 3, it's actually really fragile. It's exposed to the least amount of environmental shocks, but it's doing really badly on food security. Okay, Alex, why are you still talking to us about this graph? It's really boring. Can we move on, please? Yes, next slide, next one. What you can do, and one more. What you can do, though, what you can do is you can start thinking about the houses in the gray area and the houses in the yellow area. And you can start doing a case study on the gray houses, which are the resilient ones, or you can start collecting more data from the yellow ones to understand why they're underperforming compared to where you expect them to be. And that vertical line, that distance, is precisely the quantification of resilience that you can reach. And that should be a cool thing to think about. And you should be asking yourselves, what do the yellow things have in common? And the things they have in common should be fragility factors, should be the things that are making them fragile. And if you ask yourself, what do the gray houses have in common? It could be things like owning a fridge or negotiation skills or gender inclusion and so on and so forth, that are things that make people resilient. Next one. To give a couple of specific examples, we found that in Afghanistan, people that are exposed to conflict, of course, feel insecure at the personal and community level. But if they own, click please, a phone, that actually really helps them cope and ensure that they have good levels of a sense of personal security in the face of exposure to conflict. And the reason for that is because having access to communication, to your community, to your family, and so on and so forth, really allows you to cope. Of course, ideally, we want to target conflict exposure, right, and minimize conflict. But sometimes it's easier to buy someone a Nokia phone rather than end conflict in Afghanistan, right? That wasn't supposed to be a joke, but I'm glad. Another link that we found is, of course, that things like drought and conflict and other ecological shocks lead to food insecurity in South Sudan. And before my colleagues over there click, I want you to guess. Oh no, before you click. Oh, go back. Go back. Okay. I want you to guess, okay? And I'm sure you're gonna have brilliant guesses on what the resilience factor that we unexpectedly discovered was, right? So we asked, is it about having a phone? Is it about owning cattle? Is it about being close to a source of clean water? But it wasn't. It was, with me, having a chicken. Right? So owning chickens was the most important resilience factor for food security. And that was really surprising because South Sudan is the kind of country where cattle is God, right? Cattle is the most important thing to own. But cattle take up water and you never slaughter them, right? You don't slaughter your cattle because it's a mark of pride. But chicken, you can kill them, you can get eggs from them. And so they're portable, right? You can take 10 in a box and move if there's a drought and so on and so forth. So that was a resilience factor for food security. And that might be, again, like the phone, a really cheap and easy intervention to build resilience. Even though, of course, we do want to also be not forgetting to target the ecological shocks as well. But chicken are cheaper than solving climate change. This is a more complicated example of work that we did with Abiose and others in the piece on trying to understand how to ensure resilient, peaceful attitudes in Ethiopia in the face of exposure to all kinds of conflict adversities. Can we go to the next one? So all of this stuff like violence, disputes, even domestic abuse were found to really undermine peaceful attitudes. Right? And of course, we all know this, right? If you are exposed to these challenges, it's very likely that your own peaceful attitudes, your own levels of forgiveness, your own levels of rejection of violence might deteriorate and a cycle of violence might emerge. So we proved that this tends to happen in Ethiopia. But the question is, how do you break that cycle of violence, right? It's going to be difficult to end all forms of exposure to violence, but maybe there are other resilience factors that help protect people and make sure that they enshrine their peaceful attitudes, and that's resilient in the face of all of this stuff. And on the next slides, they appear, or maybe the next of the next slides. It's things like life skills, it's things like coexistence, it's things on the civic dimension, and it's things on the governance dimension. And of course, there's other dimensions that we tried to measure but didn't show up. Nothing economic, right? So that might not be true about other contexts, of course, but in Ethiopia, none of the economic interventions that we asked if people had experience of, so it's not a chicken and it's not a phone in Ethiopia, right? Those things might work elsewhere, but in Ethiopia, it's much more about community bonds, coexistence, good institutions, civic engagement, and so on and so forth. And that might be surprising to someone. Was to me. Next one. So this is a more detailed list of resilience factors, and I won't go through them all, but I just want to give you the sense of depth that you can do if you're actually measuring this stuff. So if you're measuring this stuff, or if you're doing case studies, and you think about these concepts, and you link them to resilience, you can build a really granular argument about precisely what you need to do to ensure that cycles of conflict are broken. Next one. Another idea that you could do is you could actually start measuring all of this stuff and create an adversity index. Some people like doing that. And one more thing you could do is to measure the resilience and fragility factors and create a resilience checklist, right? So once you've got the list of, do you have a phone? Do you have a chicken? Are you socially tolerant? Are you gender inclusive? You can go into communities or go into households or go into whatever system you're talking about and ask 10 questions to get a feeling of how resilient or fragile they are. After, of course, you've proved that it's the phone and not the bicycle and the chicken and not the cattle. Next one. So I hope you've done your homework that I asked you from about 7 minutes ago, which is to come up with a resilience research question, which is of this format of how do households ensure food security in the face of droughts, right? And for a question like that, your unit of analysis would be individuals or households. And you might think of resilience factors that are around chickens, household assets, having a fridge, access to a water source, a kitchen that is equipped with electric cooking utensils, so on and so forth. Fragility factors might be things like exclusion, right? So individuals who face droughts often survive or often are particularly fragile if they're also marginalized, right? Because in some contexts, people help each other and have solidarity. But if you don't have that social capital, that makes you more fragile. And I promised you that this was going to be a discussion on methodology. So I have to say that the appropriate measurement methodology for something at the individual level is, of course, a household level survey. I won't bore you with the details of all of this table, but just to give you a glimpse, this is the kind of thinking of how to design a resilience analysis, right? You would come up with your question, you would specify your unit of analysis, and then you would generate hypotheses of what the resilience and fragility factors are, and they could be whatever, right? And then you would make intelligent choices about how you're going to measure all that stuff. And at the household level, that's individual surveys, but at the country or the organizational level, you might need something like case studies or country level scorecards. So depending on how much time we have, I want to throw it to anyone if anyone has got a good question from their work on a resilience question. So are you facing challenges in the field or in your work that you think a resilience lens might be useful for? And how would you phrase that question? What is the agent that you want to build resilience in? What are the challenges that that agent is facing? Is it droughts or conflict? And what is the outcome that you're hoping to achieve? Attitudes, or is it food security or something else? Yes, please.
How do coastal West African communities, what makes them resistant to violent extremist offerings in the border areas of coastal West Africa, bordering the Sahel?
That's an amazing question and also really timely. And is that something that there's also an answer for? So what does make West Africa? I didn't say that this was going to be the question to not scare you, but do you know, is there consensus on what the answer to that question is?
Increased state service delivery,
Okay.
security force protection, better community relations with security forces, and of course, economic livelihoods, all that.
So those are the resilience factors, right? That's amazing. Thanks. Round of applause. Does anyone else have an interesting resilience question that they think? Yes, please.
How do marginalized groups gain upward mobility in social systems of oppression?
That's a really good question. That's a really amazing question. And has that been?
How do marginalized groups gain upward mobility in social systems of oppression?
So the adversity here is oppression, exclusion, and so on and so forth. The targeted outcome is social mobility, economic enhancement, and so on and so forth. And the agent here is marginalized groups. That's a really well-informed question. And from your work or from your experience, is there a clear answer to this question or a tentative one?
I think like the most basic thing would be access to education, but beyond that, it's difficult if you're in a society where even if you're educated, you're not going to be given a job, where you will be, like, for example, Dalits in India, you can be educated, but you might not have opportunities, or that you might be relegated to your historical.
So a fragility, resilience factor would be access to education, but a fragility factor would be that society's entrenched roles of certain groups. Okay, awesome, thank you, amazing, brilliant. Anyone else wants to get the bronze medal? Yeah.
How do you measure mental resilience or mental or emotional resilience at time of conflict?
Is that a question you're asking me, or is that the resilience question?
Is there a way to measure or
Yes.
the mental resilience?
Yes, it's hard to do, but we have done it. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in because I've been talking for a while about mental resilience, but we have measured mental resilience with indicators. Usually the indicators that you find are really well designed because psychologists really understand how to make context sensitive indicators on mental health. And that plays a really big role as well in ensuring that people can actually cope with some of the massive challenges that they're talking about. So that's very much at the individual level. sometimes chickens help, but sometimes you also need to work on someone's internal abilities to have mental resilience. Yeah.
I can come in. We've done this in Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Ukraine, and I'll turn to Abby to maybe talk a little bit about Rwanda. You're a little closer to the case study, and Ethiopia. In Ukraine, we've studied it with adolescents in the eastern part of the country, and to protect them against school dropout, and internalizing problems. Externalizing problems, basically, drug use, promiscuity, self-harm, internalizing problems, depression, anxiety, etc. And we found, for instance, trying to distinguish from parental support, to teacher support, to peer support, the school environment, which are the protective and resilience factors, and which are more fragility factors, and particularly studying at individual mental health and well-being. In Ukraine, we found that it was teachers and parent and school support that emerged as a resilience rather than parents or peers, which was a very specific intervention for UNICEF and for Ministry of Education, right? And then identify which schools that we've studied, what mechanisms did they help, so that it's not, an individual teacher. There is an enabling mechanism at the school level that is emerging, and that helped us really design tailored interventions. So maybe, yeah.
I mean, I think what Ilke is saying is demonstrating that this is very contextual, right? So you can't apply something that works in some place to another place. So maybe a couple of other examples are like Burkina Faso, which we're wrapping up that research, where we're finding that the mental resilience of young people, especially those who've been displaced by the conflict, is really contingent on the intergenerational relationships that they have. So how strong are their relationships with other adults within their community is a determining factor of them being able to maintain a certain level of mental resilience. In Ethiopia, which is a different context, we found that gender equality mindset was a key factor. So it was determining things like exposure to violence in the home, et cetera. And so that became, while that wasn't a driver of violence, it was the approach or the family kind of understanding of gender equality was really a determining factor as to whether people were able to maintain a certain level of growth mindset, for example, or whether they were able to actually have the capacity to believe in intergroup harmony and actually seek out opportunities to work with each other. And so all of these things, I think, both show that it's very contextual, but also that I think a level of understanding that peace builders often shy away from that's important is at the household level, that it's not just about what happens in the community or you as an individual, it's also the immediate system around you, which is often your family system.
Because what we've done with that finding, right? I think we're doing some really innovative work in Ethiopia with that finding, where we've designed multi-family healing spaces. So how do we intervene on the household level through improving parental practices within the culture and the norms, and providing multi-family healing spaces that can help address and limit those challenges. And we've selected a location that has IDPs, but also other institutional and civil society capacities that provide us with a fertile ground to implement such a multi-family healing space intervention.
That's amazing. I think my session is over. Thank you so much. Let's move to the next one, please.
Thank you. I always think of Alex as a professor, but also an interpreter, because he takes the most incredibly complex findings and translates it so that all of you understood. I could see all of you were captivated by Alex. So
thank you. That's very kind of you.
We're gonna switch to our online colleague. Abdon, you can hear us, I hope. And I hope technology will.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Welcome. Abdon, I think you're in Liberia, or you were in Liberia.
Yes,
Yes.
but I came back to Ivory Coast last Sunday.
And we're going to turn to you to actually help us illustrate actually specific example and case studies of where we've applied all of these types of questions, you know, from the theoretical to the empirical to the actual case studies. Over to you, Abdon.
Thank you very much. So what I will share with you is information about 2 case studies that will illustrate what Alex shared with you about the different analysis that we implemented in West Africa. The first case study will be about a case study in Niger, Tillabéri region, and then the second one will be about Ivory Coast. But before that, it's important also to share with you the information that SeeD has already, with some partners, already started working about information that relates to some questions about the spillover effect of insecurity situation from Sahel region to coastal West Africa. So I guess maybe Ilke or Alex can share later on the first report of the project we did in Northern Ivory Coast to develop a resilience index to protect communities against the influence of extremist groups. But talking about the coming session, I think if we want to summarize, and this is how the process will be following for the 6th slide that I'll be sharing with you. In the session Alex shared with you, it all started with the outcome. You can either have a desirable outcome or undesirable outcome, but here, for the 2 case studies I want to share, I will focus on the undesirable outcome. The idea here is let's think about 2 persons that are facing within the same environment similar adversities. Our analysis aims at identifying if there are some, let's say, factors that can differentiate the 2 people in terms of the undesirable or the desirable outcome. Here, the idea is to identify what makes someone not falling into the undesirable situation, while others who face the same situation, same adversities, are falling into this situation. So we can move on with the, okay. So this is what we call resilience factors that can be considered as persisting conditions or assets or capacities that protects or reduce the impact of the adversities. So in this situation, when people, as I explain it, there is possibility to understand that, and this is something that we did in the 2 case studies I will share with you, to understand that not everyone falls under the influence of the outcome, the undesirable outcome, when they are facing adversities. There are some people, and what they have in common is the factors that we consider as a resilience factor, as Alex showed in the diagram earlier. Can we move to the next slide? So the first case study where we utilized such analysis is the project in Tillabéri region, which was implemented under the partnership between SeeD and UNGPO. And the idea was about understanding the linkages between climate change and the vulnerability to armed groups, because actually there was a growing consensus among researchers and practitioners that climate change dynamics and local conflicts are kind of linked. But the idea here was to try to develop and identify how climate change influences individual or group choices and even attitudes that leads them to join, legitimize, support armed groups, and do this with robust statistical evidence. So if we move to the next slide, before performing the analysis, the key findings that we have for this first case study is that recruitment in armed groups is driven by two main dynamics that are relevant for prevention and DDR. The first one is individual behaviors and attitude, which can be addressed through psychological support, healing, and well-being, along with the DDR process. So we have individuals' violence disposition, which I will talk about later on in the resilience part, and the willingness to hold weapons. So our analysis demonstrates that these are the two entry points through which individuals easily get, let's say, influence in terms of recruitment by armed group. Some people who have certain level of violent disposition and those who are already willing to hold weapons. But there are environmental stressors and maladaptive practices which reinforce these dynamics. So some in this part, we have, for example, emotional and ideological stressors, such as PTSD and state rejection. So the people displaying this, let's say, drivers are also affecting the level of the violent disposition and even the willingness to hold weapons. So you can imagine that in a situation of conflict between herders and farmers, for example, it's easy for some of them to say that they want to hold weapon in order to protect themselves. But this is one way for them to get easily attracted and recruited by armed groups. The last one is something that was very peculiar for this project, and it is about the climate adversities that actually have been identified as also stressors that are operating at the level of violent disposition, and that is merged with the absence of the state. So it means that what we discovered is that in a situation of high climate stressors, climate adversities, and that is merged with situation where the state is absent, the people are developing certain level of violent disposition that maybe lead to recruitment. But here, it's not everyone that falls under high level of violent disposition, because when we did the resilience analysis, and meaning we should understand that the violent disposition is constituted of aggression, propensity for violence, and revenge tendency. So we understood that three adversities are having a causal relationship with these violent disposition, which are post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, perceived intensity of a climatic shock, and socioeconomic experience of climate change. These are reinforcing the level of violent disposition. And in our analysis, what we identify that is common for the people who do not, despite these adversities, do not, let's say, display high level of violent disposition, is the sense of agency and support for gender equality. Meaning the sense of agency is the belief in one's capacity to create change, etc., in the community and sometimes at the level of the society in general. So these are the indicators, and then based on these resilience factors, it is possible, for example, to develop range of intervention, propose some suggestion that will contribute in reinforcing these assets that are already existing within this community in order to cope with the adversities. In Ivory Coast, the project was about trying to understand why every time there is election in Ivory Coast, we always have violence. Because sometimes we see relatively peaceful communities that often turns into conflict, violence during election period. So our work with SeeD, with Interpeace and Indigo in Ivory Coast was about to identify drivers of electoral violent tendencies as well as drivers of electoral tendencies, as well as to provide evidence-based recommendation to break this vicious cycle toward building a more resilient community that is free from violence. And the key, as a key finding for this project before moving to the resilience part, was that we have three dynamics that were kind of structuring why people were falling under violence during political election. And these three dynamics are first the structural fragility of the community that relates to the condition that weakens social cohesion, meaning with social cohesion, we have different kind of problems in community subgroups. We have violence within community itself. We have some other social cultural discriminatory practices. All this contributes in weakening the community structure and social cohesion. And this creates the fertile ground for any kind of violent activity. The second dynamic is about the conflicting individual disposition, which relates to divisive political us versus them narrative and behavior. And it is made of conflict-prone behavior, ethnicized perception of social political life, and electoral contestation. The last dynamic that we identify as contributing to political violence tendency is the misguided civic engagement, which relates to high level but not so constructive engagement in public life. So in terms of resilience, we were trying to understand if every time we have some adversities, all the people will fall under the political violence tendency. And the idea was to identify whether or not there are some assets, some pre-existing conditions that may also help people, let's say, withstand the adversities and not fall under the influence of political violence. And these the adversities we identify here are social threats from different outgroups. We have exposure also to structural threats, which describe the kind of existing problems within the community that last for a very long time. The sense of marginalization also, tension within the community that erupt. For example, imagine that young people, teenagers are playing football and they are fighting, and this because they were not agreeing about some actions, and this specific action turns into community conflicts. So such communities these are the kind of adversities that we identify, and of course, exposure to violence. So the analysis that we perform identify forgiveness, perspective taking, voters' integrity, and critical literacy as the main factor that make the people who do not fall while experience these adversities do not fall under political violence, maybe differently from the one who directly are influenced by those conditions. And you can understand that forgiveness is the habit of no permanent anger, no retaliation, sometimes giving second chance. Perspective taking is the possibility of admitting sometimes that we are not always right. Sometimes we may be also wrong and try to give second chance. And voters' integrity here is very interesting because it drives into the process of election, because sometimes there is people who can trade the vote for money or for future opportunity. And voter integrity here is mostly about not doing that. And critical literacy is also something that's very important, because once proven wrong, sometimes it shows that the person has the possibility to come back to review his position, etc. So these are the factors that we identify, and there is possibility, for example, some recommendation, some intervention to reinforce these already, let's say, present factors that needs to be maybe spread at the community level. So this can hide and let's say trigger some intervention depending on what direction anyone wants to, or any community wants to go. So I think these are the points that I wanted to share with you, and I'll be very happy to later on replying to different questions that are related to these case studies. Thank you.
Illustrating the two case studies, both in Niger and in Côte d'Ivoire, which are extremely relevant, that very much illustrate how we go from the theory, the empirical, to really application and translation that I talked about earlier. I'm good, just to save time, I'm gonna pass over to Abby, who's gonna shake things up a little bit as well. Over to you.
Yes, my name is Abiosa Davis. I'm the head of design monitoring, evaluation, and learning at Interpiece. And I'm sure by now you guys have a lot of questions, but actually we want to pose the question back to you, because a key part of what Interpiece does in this process as well, and how we work with SeeD and how we work with other partners, is understanding these things is one thing, but translating them into practical responses is the next challenge. And it's not just about translating them into practical responses, but it's also about creating the ownership of those responses. So having those within that society actually select, what are we going to do next? What should we do? And what should we be reinforcing? So after all, this is a workshop. It's not just a panel discussion. So we're gonna put you to work. I'm going to give each of your tables a level. So I think Ilke mentioned during the presentation that we look at socioecological levels. So that means looking at individuals, looking at families, looking at the state, etc. So I've given each of you a level, and the group online actually also has a level that will be working on community level. So I think there's a group on individual level, a group on family level, a group on national institutions, and a group on regional and international systems. And what we're looking at is what can be responses at each one of these levels, or from the actors at each one of these levels. I'd like for the exercise to focus on this, which is a graph from our research in Ethiopia that SeeD and Interpiece did. And we looked at, I think earlier, Alex talked about peaceful attitudes. We were also looking at what contributes to all of those peaceful attitudes and what contributes to something like intergroup harmony. And what we found as a resilience factor that, as Ilke said earlier, a resilience factor for intergroup harmony was about having an inclusive identity. And so what contributes to having an inclusive identity and what contributes to not having an inclusive identity? What we found were the elements on the left-hand side, which are in green, are those factors that contribute to actually having a more inclusive identity. So factors such as forgiveness, factors such as religiosity, such as inclusive identity, all of these things were really contributing to intergroup harmony. And the factors that were actually reducing intergroup harmony by reducing this inclusive identity were on exposure to domestic abuse, for example, or exposure to conflict and violence, or surprisingly, a high level of political and civic engagement was also getting people to actually center their ethnicity more than finding an identity that was looking at commonality. I see someone online ask, what do we mean by inclusive identity? It means an identity that's based on commonalities with each other, with other people, rather than having an identity that is solely based on a sort of ethnic, political, or religious affiliation. So what we'd like for you to do in your groups is to take, we'll give you about 10 minutes to reflect on if you were a policymaker in Ethiopia, and this is one of the results you got. What would be your policy or practice? Because we work on both, not just what policies would you introduce, but also what actual actions would you take at your level. So at the individual level, what are the things that you might try to do to reinforce this kind of sense of ethnic or inclusive identity rather, and or to decrease the sort of ethnic centrality. And so we'll give you about 10 minutes, and instead of a report back, we're going to do a modified fishbowl kind of exercise. So it would be great if you could identify someone in your group who will be responsible for presenting your policy options and actually defending that those should be the priority options that we should be taking. So I hope that that's clear. Is it? Yes,
It's a
okay.
bit of speed dating.
Yes, it's a bit of a speed dating. So we'll give you 10 minutes, chat in your group, and then be ready to send a representative up here.
We're gonna select representation. I'll give our credit. Who starts now?
What are your ideas on?
Maybe a question.
The
Just
people,
volunteered to be the.
for the people online. Abi,
Start by
is
investing
it
in
possible
education,
to
particularly looking at the skills that they're like dispute resolution.
is it possible to switch off your microphone in the room there?
I don't know about.
Yes, Abdon, it's happening now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Education component, the basic education, but really it's not done very well. It's like something you tick off. So it would be great if something like that can be expanded and actually seriously. And the government, the national institution, would have to really prioritize creating a deeper values education curriculum and maybe investing in resources to train focus on it, to provide toolkits, to, I don't know, maybe have field trips where kids can learn about dispute resolution or negotiation or these.
Took a picture of it.
I would start now.
Something green. So the list. Notice there's a box there. But I think it was mentioned as well about social tolerance, but then representing national economic, I think it's well, with Sometimes we see in these countries that there's a lot of red tape around about how they're actually starting small enterprise. So going back some of that red tape, there are more opportunities to start businesses. I think that ties in as well with some of the other tolerance. Yeah, I think as a national thing, then maybe focusing on some of these high level things, making it easier for indigenous practices access to things, as well as investment, and I see infrastructure there, so maybe at a national level, putting more investment.
Yeah, it's like an heritage from.
I would like to add, I see there's a religiosity factor, so maybe there can also be some national level engagement with religious leaders. I think it goes along the same lines of your point on education, engaging with influencers in society, which in this case are how they can convey messages that increase
Understanding others
and invite people to more inclusive,
to understand their culture, or their practice, or their beliefs.
And in some countries they actually have, I think, commissions or whatever they call.
I think that connects also to the point about forgiveness,
where religious leaders
creating
can
spaces
meet
for
to
understanding
discuss
can foster
policies. So
I think this is
organized quite easily. I don't know in the case of
focusing on I'm not surprised about identities that could be divisive, but rather trying to
In Singapore, there's a thing called inter-religious organization, IRO. It's like a government support entity that invests in putting all the religious leaders and groups together. I don't think you see that a lot, especially
If you don't forgive, you understand why she does that. These were ashes.
I don't know about
Yeah.
what they can create.
Our own feelings.
or invest in civil society rather than create creating something new that governments, sometimes I'm a bit hesitant about the government being involved in education, being involved in civil society, but rather really setting aside resources and investing in existing organizations that are
also a sense of belonging.
rather than an external bureaucracy that's
all of
created, what already exists.
taking actions on education. The exercise is being like the authority, maybe some parties.
I'm uncomfortable with like, I know with the US government, we do a lot of social cohesion work in coastal West Africa. But I am still, we put a lot of money into it, but I'm still a little uncomfortable with like leaders and governments like teaching people dispute resolution, teaching people social cohesion and how to get along and values. I mean, I feel like I just don't know how much like an outsider like the United States are very divided, like should coastal West Africa come and teach us how to be mediate our conflicts. I'm just still very uncomfortable, just personally.
Other services.
To do stuff to increase cohesiveness of communities, but in terms of the government national institution role and then regulating religion too, we don't tend to like get into that. But in terms of government role, I would focus on service delivery. That's showing up for those communities, and because physical and civic engagement is a factor that increases ethnocentrism in Ethiopia. What are some ways the government could make political parties less ethnic based? Are there tweaks? Are there definitions for that at a national level, like to make
Really good point,
politics less
because Ethiopia
ethnic?
is very, I mean, that's a particularly for this context.
Yeah.
I think location space.
How do you assimilate from ethnicity? I don't know. I can see that. I try to figure this out.
Yes, that would be an interesting.
Your discussion sounds really interesting. I encourage you to note down 2 or 3 of the ideas that you guys expressed and decide on who's gonna jump in the fishbowl.
Could you tell us how to make political parties less ethnocentric? What's the solution for moving away from that?
Sending local authorities in the religious sphere, maybe giving them more power to be on the, but I did not volunteer.
Can I interrupt? Can I ask you to write down to the points? I've already asked you to do this and decide on who's gonna.
Taking notes. Sorry.
Thanks. About the political engagement and the ethnic component to it. I don't know if quota policies have ever worked anywhere. Quota policies, which has like quota for different ethnic groups in parliament, for example, or in ministry in government. I don't know if it's worked anywhere. So I'm thinking that there is a potential solution. Maybe in some countries it's had positive effects. In some countries
Can I
it might
invite
not.
representatives?
So it depends on how it's done.
You're the one who's doing it.
I don't know. I don't know if somebody actually a picture of the note somebody else.
Yeah, it's a good point.
If you're the national government.
No, we are.
I know this is super juicy, but I have to stop you because otherwise you won't be able to get to the rest of the agenda for the Peace Week. So can I please invite your representatives to the front?
I didn't catch everything, but you can let me know.
We don't have that much time.
Say, and Tatiana, maybe we can bring back in the.
Okay, we have four representatives. You can take it.
A round of applause.
You've become the panel now. Thank you so
Yes.
much.
So now we have a new panel. And so for our panelists,
Waiting to get the people online hooked in.
They haven't returned.
They haven't returned? Okay, so looking at this visual that is explaining what is contributing and what can reduce ethnic centrality, what policy options or practice options do you think should be the priority in the next year or two in Ethiopia? Who wants to get started?
Just send me over.
Our group had the individual level, so we spoke about different interventions that the state could enact. So for example, education efforts that kind of target a sense of belonging within the community that can foster reducing centrality. One suggestion was creating spaces where there's an effort to foster understanding between groups. So that would be another helpful intervention. There was also a suggestion to increase access to indigenous knowledge because there, in many instances, indigenous knowledge practices have already like peace building mechanisms that are part of indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And then there was a very interesting, very specific a suggestion about access to space services, like so how are people satisfied with utilities, particularly when it comes to, say, for example, water. So do people have access to the necessities of life? Because maybe sometimes divisions can be made along exit lines when the necessities of life might be provided. So these are some things to discuss.
Anyone have different policy options? Or different options?
We had the regional and international. So a few things that we spoke about were the coordinating border security forces. And another aspect was creating truth and reconciliation commissions. And we also spoke about technical management, like watershed management and skill sharing in utilities and infrastructure, which then led to another thing about green climate infrastructure, where there's mitigation, but climate financing, perhaps some sharing utilities and skills. So these are just some of the things that
When I jump in on the national level, interestingly, it's a bit connecting to individual level, especially when we look at education, because it's driven by the system yet undertaken by the individual. So investing in education was one of the first ones that came up. Then opening the ecosystem up for startups and medium-sized companies. So not necessarily reinventing the wheel and implement something completely new, but also invest into what's available and what's existing already. Then invest into infrastructure, obviously, and services, very basic. And very interestingly engaging with influencers, I think,
religious
leaders as well. And at the same time, also disconnecting politics from religion and ethnicity. Yeah. Yeah, and the last one that you mentioned was about the policies that I didn't really get.
Yeah, and it was really a hypothesis because I think we are aware it works in certain countries and in others it doesn't, but maybe have quota policies in the parliaments or in the governments, depending on the context. Yeah.
So for us, for our group, we had the family level, and of course we see some connecting threads that go throughout the different scales, and it's also quite context dependent. So some of the colleagues mentioned, for instance, approaching youth and women with targeted actions, since the family unit tends to be particularly steer towards these dynamics. Women are always kind of taking care of the household in a certain manner, particularly in a traditional setting. Also, there was another mention of the importance of trying to address the financial capital of the family, not only the cultural capital. So ideally that goes as well with fostering economic building or economic security. Then there was another one which reverberated the findings that were already consolidated. The importance of tackling domestic abuse and exposure to domestic abuse is something to combat not only the prevention of almost half of the population in terms of safety and contribution, but not to encourage having violence as means for conflict resolution. And on that, fostering a common vision, building on the experience from Sri Lanka, in terms of having a husband and wife within a household aligned, and that could be done through counseling, I learned. And another one was actually trying to identify the context. Maybe this is more preparatory work than policies themselves, but of course they have to be substantiated. Identifying in the context how important the traditional family is and how much of a conveyor belt it is for the kids. Yeah, another one, which would be equipping the family, the narratives to be some kind of a peace building unit, because I think that doing a bit of a meta reflection, even we see that as practitioners and people that are not necessarily from the community, the things we find or things we find intriguing might not be attractive on the people exactly having the family in certain contexts, like our colleague working in Sudan, identify as this building block of society as a whole. If we can turn it into a building unit by having domestic violence, for instance, we need more.
And then can we get, Abdon, I don't know if you or somebody else from online is going to share what you came up with for the community level?
We were at the stage of identifying, let's say, indicators where we've been kicked out of the breakout rooms. But maybe I will give the floor to Jennifer at least to share something about.
Yes, yeah, I echo that. We did not have a lot of time to come to a consensus by any means, but there was just a few of our group talking about the emphasis on forgiveness and community. And then one practical suggestion was the implementation of community mediation training that has had some evidence in other projects that we could implement. So community mediation training, if we had to have a consensus, I would say that's it.
So I think what we were trying to demonstrate is that there are a range of options that you can have when you look at it from a resilience lens, right? And where we're trying to expand, and I think the aim of our work on resilience is expanding the toolbox of options of responses that you can typically get. I think in a typical peace building program, when you're looking at reducing ethnic centrality, people want to focus on dialogue. So how do we bring together two people from the different communities to talk? Or how do we get the religious leaders or the elders to start making agreements? However, what we see from the resilience measurement is that things like gender equality in the home or reducing domestic violence also have a significant impact on reducing aspects around identity and openness to other people. Things around forgiveness give us an option to look at how do we foster forgiveness through things in school or through healing groups. So there's a range of perhaps options that are not very visible to us if we are only looking at the fragility factors. But if we better understand what is contributing to these factors, like Alex said, asking these questions, who's the agent, what's the outcome that we're trying to foster, and what's the adversity that we are working against, then we have really a more holistic view of options that we have to address an issue. I think we're nearing the end, so I just wanted to maybe open just for one or two questions for anybody who has presented. Thank you to our co-panelists. up just to see if we have one or two questions that we could quickly answer and then, yeah.
Well, I spoke, if somebody else has a question. No, I was really interested in how like family came up many times, and one of the people who was presenting talked about they use really interesting language around family as a conveyor belt for ideas and the multiplying factors. I don't know if you could speak more to like what you're learning about the role of family and resilience. I just think it's not something that you find being spoken of in like highly technical UN spaces. I'm coming from New York, so this is like so refreshing. And so it'd be just interesting to learn more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to speak about it. Of one of our approaches that we are developing and testing together as SeeD and Interpiece is on multifamily healing, which is an approach that is aimed at both fostering more democratic parenting, more less authoritarian parenting, and really aiming to foster certain types of behaviors within the family that then can translate into how people show up outside of the family, right? And so what we're learning is, you know, the extent to which people are open and honest in discussion within their families, the extent to which they're making decisions together, especially around the sharing of resources, that all of these are helping to foster family resilience and also the resilience of especially the young people within those households. So I don't know if Alex and Ilke want to add to anything that I've said, but yeah.
I think you've covered most, but we asked questions, for instance, your perception of the family bonds and closeness, but how you make decisions in the family, whether different members of the family have access to the family assets equally. We found even I say even, but in Cyprus, that, for instance, women said they don't have access to household assets, like even remote control of the TV. So they don't make decisions about what the family is watching, or they have less access to the car and the vehicle. And we also ask questions about the democratic parenting, whether children feel as close to their fathers as they do to their mothers, as well as the trust and opening up, like whether you go to your family with a problem beyond feeling sense of bond and responsibility. And those are very revealing, both in terms of screening questions to understand family coherence and vulnerabilities, and also how you can help enhance family relationships. And it's still remain not prescriptive, but very well-being oriented.
And just to say that this is, I mean, this kind of look at the family is not coming out of nowhere. Our work in Rwanda has been over the past 20-something years. In Burundi, we're nearing, I think, 17 years. And these are contexts in which young people have told us one of the problems that we're having is really understanding how we show up in society and the stereotypes that we have, because we hear messages repeated in our household, but we don't know why. We know that our parents have been affected by the conflict, but we don't know how to have those conversations in the home. So providing the platform for those kind of discussions in a very constructive way is what we're aiming to bring to kind of change those dynamics.
Because we also found, I think it was in Rwanda, where trauma is inherited, and it's inherited generation to generation, and sometimes that trauma can get compounded through inheritance, right? Even if you're not the first person experience of the trauma, that inheritance can get compounded almost you see this traumas in diaspora, even though they have extracted themselves from it, that the trauma is real and palpitating. And we see that in the family unit as well, how that inheritance can actually compound on younger members of the family.
If I may also.
We can take more questions from the floor.
Yeah,
because we've only had one question.
I think I think we're literally going to be thrown out, so I'm going to take one question. And if you want, I think we can just stick around for a few more minutes outside if you have any questions, but the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for the very engaging workshop, by the way. I just wanted to ask if you see any pronounced trends among resilience factors between regions. So for instance, are there more obvious resilience factors in Africa versus Asia and Europe?
Interesting. Alex, do you want to?
Short answer is no. Resilience is really, really context specific.
And we might even find different resilience factors within the same country across different groups. I mean, both subnationally, but also resilience factors across demographic groups can be different. And then I think, to be absolutely frank, I don't think 20 cases was enough to establish such a pattern for us as well. Abdon, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, just quickly added about the family situation, that the case study in Niger highlighted in one part of the analysis that family household was represented a kind of shield that protects the individuals from being recruited by armed groups. And family and community, provided the community is let's say an extension of family. These two dimensions were let's say displaying a protective influence on individuals against recruitment. So it's very important and relevant to the question earlier.
So with that, I'm really afraid I'm gonna have to stop. The organizers are pretty strict about time. I promised you I was not gonna speak a lot, and I held my promise. But thank you so much for your active participation. I think we can just go outside. If you have a few extra questions and wanna stick around and still, engage with our panelists, you're welcome to, but thanks a lot for your questions.
Thank you for coming. We're looking for any questions, and we've left some material. If that's of interest to you, please take it with you. Thank you everyone so much.
Thank you. That was awesome.
They live in
Ce n'era solo una che
Thank you. So, it's good to see you.
Wow.